Number 12. Lance o Meadows, a D1021. Not around the year 1000, not legend, not literary atmosphere. A precise year, locked into tree rings by a spike of solar radiation, and preserved in wood cut by metal tools at the edge of North America. The date lands hard. Norse sailors were here nearly 5 centuries before Columbus. At Lance o Meadows, archaeologists uncovered 8 turf structures, a forge, workshops, ship repair debris, and about 800 artifacts. This was not a fantasy voyage. It was organized transatlantic skill. Yet for hundreds of years, the knowledge survived mostly as sagas many people treated as exaggeration. A civilization learned to cross the ocean, harvest bog iron, repair ships at a remote base, and then left so little visible memory that later generations called it myth. That tension sits under this site, and under every impossible place that later proved real. Number 12. The shore where the story lands. You are pulling at a patch of grass in the far north of Newfoundland, and the ground does not behave like wild ground. It lifts in a neat skin. Roots hold to roots. Sod comes away in a thick mat. Under it, the earth rises in a curve too deliberate for wind, too straight for chance. The air off Epaves Bay is cold enough to sting the inside of your nose. The Atlantic is gray. The treeless headland feels empty in the way old working places do, as if the people are gone, but the task still hangs there. It is 1960. Helge Ingstad stands a few feet away, looking down, not speaking yet. Beside him is George Decker, the local man who brought him here, to these grass-covered bumps the villagers never treated as European ruins. From a distance, they are just ridges. Up close, they begin to line up. One wall runs, then turns. Another answers it. The shape is wrong for a natural swell, and wrong in exactly the right way. Ingstad kneels. He presses his palm against the cut edge of the turf. The layers show themselves like stacked history. Sod, soil, more sod packed and laid by hands that expected winter. He knows the sagas. He knows the stories of ships sailing west from Greenland to a country of timber and resources and danger. But stories are cheap on their own. Every coast has stories. Every empty place collects one. So he keeps looking. A little farther on, another rise, then another. Not one mound, a pattern. The headland opens into a spread of low outlines, enough room for a small encampment, enough shelter from the wind if the walls were thick and roofed. You can almost feel the geometry under the grass before you see it. 8 shapes will eventually emerge here. 3 dwellings, 1 forge, 4 workshops. But right now they are still sleeping in the turf, waiting for someone to admit they are buildings. The cut widens. Soil darkens. A line of post impressions appears where timber once stood upright and carried a roof. This is not a stone ruin. It is something more fragile and more intimate. Timber-framed turf construction, built by people who knew how to arrive fast, build warm, and survive at the edge of weather. You can picture them doing it. Men stepping off a ship onto a coast that smells of salt and wet grass. Axes biting wood. Turf blocks carved and stacked. Smoke driven low by the wind. But a camp can still be anyone's camp. Fishermen, settlers, later intruders. The ground has to do more than suggest walls. It has to show work. That happens in the blackened earth of a small structure set apart from the others. The space is tighter. The soil is burned. Slag begins to appear. Small, ugly, necessary. Bog iron. Someone came to this wet northern edge, dug iron from the bogs, smelted it, and worked it here. Not by accident, not once. A forge means heat, fuel, tools, skill. It means maintenance. It means men who expected metal to fail and knew how to make it useful again. Then the debris starts talking all at once. Broken nails, wooden fragments, waste from carpentry. Material that looks less like domestic life and more like repair. The kind of litter left when a vessel is being made seaworthy again before another push into unknown water. The ocean is not a backdrop here. It is the reason this place exists. You do not build a forge on the fringe of North America for symbolism. You build it because your ship has crossed an ocean, and will need to cross one again. In the years that follow, from 1961 to 1968, Anne Stein Ingstad takes over the excavation, and the headland yields piece by piece. Under her direction, the ridges become rooms, thresholds, workspaces. The site stops being a possibility and becomes a settlement. Not large, not permanent in the way of a growing town, more like a hard, competent outpost, a base camp that could hold perhaps 90 people for a few years while crews slept, repaired, forged, sorted supplies, and prepared to move on. You are standing in one of the dwellings now as the walls come clear. The footprint is long, insulated by turf thick enough to lock out Atlantic cold. People lived in this shape, ate in it, slept in it, waited out weather in it. Outside, the workshops cluster around the practical needs of survival. Inside, the space narrows the distance between you and them to almost nothing. 1,000 years fall away fast when you are looking at a doorway. Then comes the object that cuts through every remaining excuse. A bronze ring-headed cloakpin of Viking age type, small enough to fit in one hand, damning enough to redraw a continent. Not because a pin is grand, but because it is ordinary. Ordinary things are the hardest things to explain away. A saga can drift. A rumor can swell. A bronze fastening dropped in the dirt by a Norse traveler does neither. And the scene keeps widening. Among the finds are butternuts and a butternut burl, things that do not grow in Newfoundland. Now the camp is no longer the end of the journey. It is the hinge of it. Someone sailed or traveled south into regions warmer than this, into country where such trees grew, then carried that material back north again. The people on this headland were not simply landing. They were ranging, testing, moving out and returning. So picture the place alive. A ship has come in after days at sea, hull scraped, rivets checked, timber creaking. Men jump into the shallows and drag her up far enough to inspect the damage. Others cut wood with metal tools. Others stack turf. In the forge, bog iron is smelted and worked into the nails and fittings a vessel cannot do without. In the workshops, shavings collect. Broken pieces are tossed aside. Repairs continue by fading light. Someone brings back material from farther south, proof that this bay is a northern base, not the whole map. Smoke threads sideways in the wind. The Atlantic keeps breathing beyond the roofs. No speeches, no sense of destiny, just practiced labor, repeated by people who know exactly what each task costs if it is done badly. Crossing the ocean took generations to master. Holding a foothold at the far edge of it took even more. Here on this headland, that knowledge survives in the bluntest possible form. Walls, slag, nails, wood, a pin. Then the wind moves over the site again. The roofs vanish. The walls soften into humps. For centuries, the working place turns back into grass. When the date finally comes, it is brutally exact. AD 1021. Number 11. Lake Guatavita. On December 11, 1911, a catalogue at Sotheby's in London turned a sacred landscape into sale lots. Gold objects, ceramic vessels, pieces recovered from Lake Guatavita, 57 kilometers north of Bogotá, high in the Andes at about 3,100 meters above sea level. By then the crater lake had already been cut, drained, and raked by men convinced that somewhere under its dark water lay proof of El Dorado. One of those men was Hartley Knowles. Between 1900 and 1911, he and Contractors Limited treated the lake as an engineering job. Lower the water, expose the mud, collect what glittered, ship it out. The catalog matters because it shows the moment the myth changed shape. It stopped being a rumor in a conquistador's report. It became inventory, measured, packed, priced. A ritual that once made sense inside a living culture was broken apart, exported, and sent back into the world as treasure with no context. The gold survived. The meaning did not. Knowles did not invent the obsession. Spanish chroniclers had done that centuries earlier. They described a ceremony among the Muisca, whose ceremonial world included lakes in the Guatavita-Guasca Valley. In the most famous version, a new ruler was covered in gold dust, taken by raft into the lake, and offerings were cast into the water. Gold, yes, but not only gold. Seeds, plants, cotton, corn, ceramic containers. The lake was not a vault. It was a place where wealth was deliberately removed from circulation and given away. Europe heard that story and mistranslated it. The gilded man became a golden kingdom. Then the kingdom became a city. Then the city became a target. By the time Knowles arrived, that fantasy had already crossed the Atlantic twice. First, as a colonial misunderstanding, then as capital. You can picture him at the crater edge, looking down into that near-perfect basin and seeing not a shrine or a ritual landscape, but a trapped account waiting to be opened. The lake sits inside a reserve that now covers 613 hectares, but to treasure hunters, it presented a simpler shape, a bowl. Bowls can be emptied. They tried. The scar is still there, a notch cut into the crater rim. Landscape surgery meant to force the water down, literally. Men carved an outlet through the side so the lake could drain and expose the bottom. That detail makes the whole thing physical, not legend in a book. Picks, mud, timber, labor at altitude, cold mornings, slippery slopes. Below them, the muck where offerings had settled over generations. Stand there in your mind and the scene sharpens. Water drops inch by inch. The shoreline widens. Black sediment appears where there should be only reflected sky. Workers move in with baskets and tools. A man stoops and lifts a piece of worked metal from clay that has not seen daylight in centuries. Another turns up a ceramic vessel. Not much by the standards of men chasing a city. Enough to keep the machine running. Enough to convince investors that the next layer might be the one. That was Guatavita's trap for outsiders. It was real enough to reward belief, but not in the form belief expected. Yes, objects came out of the lake. Yes, the Muisca had made offerings there. Yes, the story behind El Dorado was anchored to a real place. That made the fantasy harder to kill. Every recovered object looked like proof that the city must still be waiting somewhere deeper down. Knowles's operations fed that illusion, even as they should have destroyed it. The items that passed through his hands ended up dispersed. Cambridge holds examples linked to those drainage works. The British Museum preserves objects from the 1909 attempt. The Metropolitan Museum has material from the same long fever. Each piece is evidence. But evidence of what depends on who is looking. To a buyer in 1911, it could mean treasure from the lost land of gold. To an archaeologist, it means a ritual economy with its own logic. To the Muisca world it once belonged to, it meant the opposite of hoarding. Value was being surrendered, not stored. The deeper Knowles dug into the myth, the more completely he stood inside its misunderstanding. The object most people now associate with El Dorado did not come from Hartley Knowles. It did not come from Lake Guatavita at all. In April 1969, a farmer named Cruz Maria Di Mate discovered a small gold raft in a cave at Pasca, far from the lake itself. Not a city, not a palace, a votive object, tucked inside a ceramic offering container with other pieces. It is only 19.5 centimeters long, 10.1 wide, 10.2 high, and made of an alloy that is more than 80% gold, mixed with native silver and copper. In that tiny form, it preserved the image Europeans had swollen beyond recognition: figures on a raft, a central elite personage, ceremony rendered in metal. The human chain matters here. Di Mate found it, and the raft could easily have vanished into the same pipeline that swallowed Guatavita's offerings. Sold quietly, melted down, broken into value by weight. Priest Jaime Hincapié helped stop that, and Colombia's central bank acquired it for the Gold Museum. One man helped strip a lake in search of a fantasy. Another helped save a small object that showed what the fantasy had really grown from. Hard-won knowledge can vanish not only when a culture is destroyed, but when its surviving evidence is translated into the wrong language. The Muisca knew what a lake offering meant. Conquistadors turned it into a story of infinite bullion. Entrepreneurs turned that story into excavation. Auction houses turned excavation into lots. What should have clarified the truth kept burying it. Even now, Guatavita does not yield a perfectly simple answer. Some Spanish accounts describe spectacular public ceremonies. More recent archaeological work suggests a shrine marked by smaller-scale offerings, rather than constant grand pageantry. So the famous scene may have been rare. It may have been exaggerated. Chroniclers may have stitched several rituals into one irresistible image. That uncertainty does not make the place less real. It makes it more human. Rituals shift. Witnesses embellish. Outsiders misunderstand. A myth grows around a core of fact until the fact is almost impossible to see. Knowles never found a golden city because there was no golden city to find. What he found instead were fragments of a ceremonial world. By forcing them to confess to the wrong story, he helped erase the right one. The lake did not hide El Dorado. It generated it, not as a place of endless treasure, but as a place where treasure was meant to disappear. The notch in the crater rim matters more than any single object pulled from the mud. It is the mark left when greed mistakes a ritual for a reservoir. The damage is visible. The original meaning is not. One witness to the old story had put it more plainly centuries before. The ruler went out upon the water, and offerings were thrown in, so that the lagoon received them. Number 10. The Palace of Knossos. The palace that looked so much like a legend that people mistook a bureaucracy for a monster story. In March 1900, Arthur Evans stood on a low hill about 5 kilometers southeast of Heracleion and started cutting into the earth at Knossos. He was not entering an empty field. 22 years earlier, in 1878, a local merchant named Minos Kalokairenos had already opened part of the west wing and proved something large was down there. Evans arrived with money, crews, notebooks, and a theory. Within weeks, walls began to rise out of the soil. Then came a chamber with a gypsum seat built against the wall, the throne room. Then corridors, storerooms, staircases, workshops, shrines, painted plaster. The plan was so tangled that the old story of Minos and the labyrinth stopped sounding decorative and started sounding like a description of a place. That was the sensation. Ancient Greek myth had placed King Minos at Knossos, inside a domain haunted by Daedalus, the Minotaur, and a maze no one could escape. Evans believed he had found the physical core of that tradition, and he gave the buried culture a name taken straight from the story, Minoan. It fit neatly, maybe too neatly. The ruins were real. The claim attached to them has to be separated, piece by piece. Start with the layout. The main palace complex dates broadly from 2000 to 1350 BC. The built area runs to about 22,000 square meters. This was not a temple on a peak or an isolated tomb. It was a vast complex arranged in 4 wings around a central courtyard. Map those wings, and the picture changes fast. There are royal quarters, yes, but also storerooms, workshops, shrines, repositories, banquet halls, and administrative spaces. This is the architecture of management. Goods come in, goods are stored, ritual happens, feasts happen, orders move outward. Walk in expecting a prison for a half-bull monster, and the evidence keeps handing you something drier and stronger, an operating center. The storerooms are a clue by themselves. Long magazines lined with huge storage jars are not decoration. They are accounting in clay and stone. They imply collection, redistribution, and oversight. Someone was tracking oil, grain, wine, crafted goods, offerings, maybe all of it at once. In that sense, a labyrinth does not have to be a trap. It can be an institution. The further Evans dug between 1900 and 1931, the less Knossos looked like a stage set for one heroic myth. It looked more like the nerve center of a society that had learned to organize labor, ritual, and surplus on a very large scale. Myths flatten places into symbols. Knossos does not stay flat. Look at the chronology. The palace was active for centuries. Around 1450 BC, it was partially destroyed. After that, Knossos was settled by Mycenaeans from mainland Greece. So before classical Greeks turned Minos into legend, the site had already lived more than one life. A palace changes hands. Archives change language. Ritual spaces are reused. Meaning shifts. If you want to know how hard-won knowledge disappears, one mechanism is right here. It does not vanish. It gets taken over. The building remains, but the people who knew exactly how it worked do not. This is where the labyrinth evidence gets slippery. There is a real artifact often pulled into the argument, the so-called labyrinth fresco from Knossos. These are maze-like painted plaster fragments. Evans saw them as support for the ancient tradition. At first glance, the attraction is obvious. You find a sprawling palace tied to Minos, then uncover a pattern that seems to echo a maze, and the fit feels almost too clean. Later scholarship pushed back. Those fragments were probably painted floor plaster from a corridor, not proof that Bronze Age Cretans built or named a literal labyrinth in the mythic sense. The clue is real. The leap is the problem. This is the detective work people skip. The myth moves faster. Knossos gave the ancient world plenty to remember. Scale, complexity, bull imagery, ceremonial life, disorienting architecture, power concentrated in one place. Any of that could seed a story. You walk in and turn left, then right, then down a stair, then into light again. Rooms open into courts, courts into corridors, corridors into rooms. You are inside a machine built over centuries, altered, damaged, rebuilt. It does not need a minotaur to be confusing. It only needs to be real. Evans did more than excavate. He interpreted, he reconstructed, he named. That gave the world a palace, but it also gave the world a version of the palace already leaning toward epic. Minoan is not a neutral label taken from an inscription found on site. It is a modern name borrowed from a mythical king. So Knossos entered global imagination with archaeology and storytelling fused at the root. The evidence was ancient, the framing was modern. You can still see the double effect in what visitors expect. They come for the labyrinth. They find an administrative and ritual complex on a scale that still feels startling. They arrive looking for a monster story. Instead, they meet magazines, courts, drains, workshops, shrines, and traces of a palace economy. The myth does not become irrelevant. It becomes diagnostic. Sometimes a legend survives because it distorts the past. Sometimes it survives because it preserves the outline of something real after the operating instructions are gone. That is the case file at Knossos. Not myth false, archaeology true. Not the Minotaur was real. Something more awkward sits in the middle. A legendary address anchored to a genuine place. A palace so intricate that later memory may have turned administration into maze, ritual into terror, and royal power into one unforgettable name: Minos. By the time UNESCO inscribed Knossos on July 17, 2025, as part of the Minoan palatial centers, alongside Phaistos, Malia, Zakros, Zominthos, and Kydonia, the address had completed a strange journey. First oral tradition, then buried remains, then excavation, then reconstruction, then world heritage. The hill that once carried a monster story was now officially recognized as an archaeological landscape. Official recognition does not settle the oldest question there. It sharpens it. If the Greek labyrinth was a distant memory of Knossos, then myth preserved more truth than it had any right to. If Evans's choices taught the modern world to see a maze, whether the ruins demanded one or not, then one of archaeology's most famous discoveries arrived wrapped in its own embellishment. At Knossos, both possibilities still move together down the corridor, side by side, until the turn. Number 9. Troy. Troy. On a low mound called Helike, 4.8 kilometers from the southern entrance to the Dardanelles, a place occupied for about 4,000 years, sat inside one of history's oldest arguments. Was this city real, or only Homer's address for a war? In 1801, Edward Clarke stood at the hill and identified it as ancient Ilion from coins and inscriptions. That mattered because the plain around the Dardanelles was full of candidates, and every one of them had a story to sell. Clarke had something better: material evidence, a name, a place, a trace. The answer did not come from one clue. It came from years of pressure. By 1868, Frank Calvert owned land near the mound and was convinced it was the right site. He pushed Heinrich Schliemann toward the hill. In 1870, Schliemann began the first major excavations. Troy stopped being only a poem on paper. It became dirt, stone, ash, and walls. Not one Troy, but many. Layer after layer, city after city, all buried under the same rise. That is how archaeology works at Helike. You do not open one room and find the legend waiting in the middle. You cut downward through centuries. Each layer gives a different answer to the same question. A wall changes the odds. A ditch, a gate, a foundation shows what people feared, what they defended, and what they expected to survive. At Troy, the mound was the mechanism. Time had not erased the city. Time had hidden it by building over it. In 1873, Schliemann found the thing that made the site famous far beyond archaeology. He announced Priam's treasure, a cache of gold and valuables that he claimed belonged to Homer's royal Troy. The name did the work. In one sentence, centuries of uncertainty collapsed into a dramatic discovery. Later dating broke that claim apart. The treasure was more than 1,000 years too early. The objects were real. The association with Priam was not. That correction made the site sharper, not smaller. The city was still real. The treasure was still real. Only the label had failed. So the problem changed. If this was not Homer's exact moment, then what was it? The answer began to show in the late Bronze Age levels, especially Troy 6 and 7a. Later excavations revealed strong walls, a lower town, and a position that made immediate sense. The mound sits near the narrow passage between the Aegean and the Black Sea world. Control that point, and you do more than watch ships. You influence them. You collect from them. You wait for the wind to turn in your favor, or to trap everyone else nearby. The geography explains the pressure. Ships moving toward or away from the Dardanelles could be pinned by currents and weather. They had to wait. And when ships wait, people spend. They need food, repair, water, shelter, labor, guides, and time. Troy may not have prospered only because it was defended. It may have prospered because it was useful. The sea itself could create a captive market. The city stood on a bottleneck. The fortifications match that picture. Archaeologists have documented 24 excavation campaigns, 23 wall sections, 11 gates, and 5 defensive bastion bases. The late Bronze Age lower city covered about 30 hectares, roughly 75 acres. A defensive ditch cut into limestone bedrock measured about 11.5 feet wide and 6.5 feet deep. Those are tactical numbers. They show where pressure was expected. They show what kind of place this was to attack, and what kind of place it was to live inside. The most telling evidence did not come from stone alone. It came from tablets. Hittite records mention Wilusa and a ruler named Alexandu. One treaty ties that world to the Hittite king Muwatalli II, who ruled around 1295 to 1272 BC. Wilusa is likely Troy. That does not prove the war in Homer. It does something narrower and more solid. It places the city inside a real political field between Anatolia and the Aegean, where alliances, obligations, and threats were written down. Now the legend has a frame. Not one perfect epic battlefield, but a real city in a contested zone. Not a clean yes or no answer, but a tight overlap of evidence and memory. Homer may have preserved a memory of several conflicts around Wilusa and Troy, or he may have turned one local struggle into a 10-year war that could survive in song. Archaeology proves a fortified city, a lower town, destruction, and long occupation. It does not prove Achilles at the wall. On the ground, Troy was a working settlement with gates, ditches, and trade pressure from the straits. On the page, it was where kings gathered and heroes died. Officially, it is a Bronze Age site with 24 campaigns of excavation and a UNESCO inscription in 1998. In the story people carried, it was the city whose siege became the template for all sieges. That split shows how knowledge survives. The city did not vanish. It kept being rebuilt, reoccupied, and reimagined. Greek and Roman Ilion later became a prestige destination for visitors, leaders, and emperors who wanted to stand where legends said history had happened. The place kept its name, but not its certainty. Troy ends where mythic places often end when the dirt is finally opened. Officially, it is a mound with layers, walls, ditches, tablets, and a long occupational sequence. In the public imagination, it is the city of Helen, Priam, and the wooden horse. One version is archaeological, the other is unforgettable. The real site sits between them, a hill above the straits, holding both at once. Number 8. Hattusa. What if the story was true in the most ordinary, devastating way possible? Not a vanished city swallowed whole by sand, not a golden kingdom exaggerated by later poets, a real capital, with clerks, storage rooms, tax records, treaties, and rituals precise enough to run an empire for generations. Then, within a few bad years, the people who knew how to keep that machine alive were gone. If that is true, the consequence is blunt. Knowledge does not have to be destroyed to disappear. It only has to lose the people who can read it. In 1915, nearly a decade after the first great excavations at Boğazköy, a linguist named Bedřich Hrozný looked at clay tablets from central Anatolia and realized the dead language in front of him was not dead in the way anyone expected. It was Hittite, an Indo-European language, the oldest one ever securely attested. A civilization that had sat for centuries in ancient texts as a shadow suddenly had grammar, verbs, official formulas, and a voice that could be heard again after more than 3,000 years. That matters because walls can prove a city stood here, but only archives can prove who ruled it, what they feared, and how far their orders traveled. The shock had begun earlier. In July 1834, French explorer Charles Texier reached the ruins near modern Boğazköy in central Turkey and found something too large to fit the usual picture. Massive stone walls, gates, carved blocks, the broken geometry of a serious city. But he did not know he was standing in Hattusa, the lost capital of the Hittite Empire. For most of the 19th century, the Hittites themselves were half-lit figures, known mainly from scattered references in older texts. They were present, but thinly, a name without an address. So the real turn came in 1906, when German Assyriologist Hugo Winkler and Ottoman archaeologist Theodore Macready began digging into the site. Within weeks, the ground stopped behaving like ruins and started behaving like an archive. Thousands of cuneiform tablets emerged from the soil. Royal correspondence, diplomatic records, laws, rituals, inventories, treaties. Not one inscription boasting that a king had once stood here, but a whole administrative nervous system. Almost 30,000 clay tablets have now been recovered from Boğazköy Hattusa. UNESCO's Memory of the World record counts nearly 25,000 in the Great Archive alone. The mythic people did not just become real, they became legible, and that changes the scale immediately. Hattusa was not a lonely citadel on a ridge. It was an imperial capital, enclosed by more than 8 kilometers of monumental walls, with more than 100 towers and 5 known gateways in the upper city. Lion Gate, royal buildings, temples, a rock sanctuary nearby at Yazilikaya. You can feel the shift in the evidence. One moment you were looking at broken stone in Anatolia. The next, you were standing inside a state. Picture the practical side of that state. Messengers move through the gates before dawn. Scribes knead damp clay into tablets while envoys wait for copies. Officials record deliveries, cult obligations, border instructions. A treaty sealed here is carried hundreds of miles and enforced by men who have never seen the capital. That is how power really looks when it works. Not just armies, records, formulae, archives, repetition. So when Hattusa turned out to be real, it did more than confirm a lost place from old references. It restored the machinery behind the legend. But the strangest part is how close that machinery came to being erased twice. The first time happened around 1200 BCE, when the Hittite world began to break apart. The capital was abandoned and later burned. The final sequence is still unresolved. Archaeology suggests the city may have been largely emptied before the fire. So this may not have been a last stand at the gates. It may have been something colder: withdrawal, fragmentation, systems failing one by one. In 2023, a nature study tied a severe 3-year drought in central Anatolia to the years 1198 to 1196 BCE, exactly when the Hittite collapse unfolds. That does not close the case. Drought is not the same as destiny, but it gives the disaster texture. Harvests fail, supply lines strain, provinces pull inward. A capital that rules by coordination suddenly has less and less to coordinate. Then comes the second near erasure. Once the city is empty, its knowledge should die with it. Clay tablets are fragile when wet. Shelves collapse, roofs rot, names detach from places. That is usually how the administrative memory of a state ends, not in one dramatic blaze, but in slow illegibility. Hattusa got the opposite. The later burning baked many of the tablets hard enough to survive. The catastrophe that finished the capital helped preserve its paperwork. The empire falls, but the fire saves the files. So when scholars finally read Hattusa back into reality, they were not resurrecting a rumor. They were reopening a government archive. They could see treaties with foreign powers, ritual texts, legal formulas, diplomatic language polished by use. They could watch a Bronze Age superpower thinking on clay. And more than a century after Winkler and Macready began excavating, those archives are still changing the map. In 2023, researchers working on a Hittite ritual text identified a previously unknown Indo-European language embedded inside it. Even now, the tablets are not finished speaking. That is the unnerving consequence of the place. Hattusa shows that an empire can vanish so completely that later centuries remember only fragments. But the fragments, if enough survive, can reassemble the empire in reverse. First a ruin, then a name, then a language, then a bureaucracy, then the outline of people who believed their orders, treaties, and ceremonies would continue indefinitely. Officially, Hattusa is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, inscribed in 1986. On the ground, it is stone, slope, gate, and weather in central Turkey. But years after the kingdom that ruled from here disappeared, the thing that brought it back was not a palace treasure or a heroic inscription. It was administrative residue, the leftovers of people doing routine work well enough to bind a state together. And that loops back to the darker possibility underneath this whole story. If generations of hard-won knowledge can vanish here, it does not require ignorance in the people who built it. It requires interruption, enough drought, enough political fracture, enough movement of courts and grain and soldiers that a capital empties before anyone admits the system is ending. By the time the fire comes, the knowledge is already homeless. At Hattusa, the empire did not return as a crown or a battlefield or a king's tomb. It returned as shelves of clay pulled out of silence. And somewhere beyond the Lion Gate, as the light drops and the stones go cold, you can almost see the last rooms left open, records abandoned in place, waiting for a fire that would preserve them better than the people who wrote them. Number 7. Nineveh, a city that survived as a rumor for 2,500 years, then reappeared in stone. In 1847, British explorer Austen Henry Layard began digging at Kuyunjik, one of the great mounds on the edge of modern Mosul in northern Iraq. What he found was not a pleasant surprise. It was a capital. It was Nineveh. By then, Nineveh had already lived two lives. The first was flesh and power, a real Assyrian metropolis established around 700 BCE, raised to the status of capital, ringed by a wall more than 12 kilometers long, and guarded by 6 gates that once controlled everything moving in and out of the city. The second life was stranger. It survived in scripture, in memory, in warnings, in the kind of name that gets repeated so often it starts to sound like a symbol instead of a place. For centuries, that was almost all anyone had. A name, a mound, a story that might have been true. Layard's trench changed that. Not because he found a single spectacular object, but because the ground began to answer in layers. Stone reliefs came out first, carved with scenes of royal power and war, the kind of images Assyria used to announce itself to the world. Then came the throne room suite of Sennacherib's palace, with relief slabs still in position, the architecture of authority frozen where it had fallen. A loose inscription can be moved, stolen, misunderstood. A throne room in place is harder to argue with. It tells you not just that a name existed, but that a city once organized space around a king, around ceremony, around the machinery of empire. The archaeology kept tightening the case. A city that biblical tradition treated like warning and legend started to behave like stratigraphy. Walls, gates, palaces, inscribed stone, a vast urban plan. Not a single ruin, but a whole civic system, buried and then exposed in pieces. UNESCO's dossier places Nineveh as the Assyrian capital around 700 BCE, and the city's destruction in 612 BCE gives the story its brutal edge. It was not lost because it was small. It was lost because it was too important to survive the collapse that came for it. When the end arrived, it arrived decisively. You can stand at a place like this and feel the scale before you understand the details. The walls stretched for over 12 kilometers. The city was not some isolated shrine in the desert. It was a metropolis, a center of administration, ritual, violence, and memory. For modern audiences, the shock is simpler than that. Nineveh was supposed to belong to the realm of the mythical, one more ancient city preserved only because stories refused to let it die. But the site never depended on belief alone. It depended on the stubbornness of the earth. There had already been a hint before Layard ever arrived. In 1820, Claudius James Rich visited the site, and later Paul-Émile Boda's probing in the region pointed archaeologists toward the Assyrian world. Hints are not proof. Hints are what you have before the ground gives up its names. Layard's work in 1847 turned suggestion into evidence, and evidence into a city. He was not just identifying Nineveh. He was dragging it back into history in the only way that really counts, by finding what the city had physically left behind. Nineveh was not only under one mound. It was spread across a living landscape. The Nebi Yunus mound sat about 1.6 kilometers south of Kuyunjik, long covered by houses around a mosque associated with Jonah. So the city survived twice over again, once in ruins and once in devotion. One memory was archaeological, the other was sacred. That overlap is exactly what makes lost places so dangerous to our assumptions. We think disappearance means absence. Here, the place was never empty. It was only hidden inside other forms of meaning. Nineveh hits harder than a simple rediscovery story. It does not just prove that a famous city was real. It shows how real places can be reduced to symbols, then buried under centuries of repetition, until the symbol feels older than the ground itself. When Layard dug into Kuyunjik, he did not uncover a fantasy made solid. He uncovered a metropolis with a documented fall, a massive wall, 6 gates, palaces, inscriptions, and the physical outline of an imperial capital that had once dominated the ancient Near East. The strange part is how fragile that certainty is. For generations, the city lived in texts, then it lived in trenches, then it lived in museums, labels, and maps. But even now, huge parts of Nineveh remain hard to see, altered by later occupation, by modern construction, by conflict, by the simple fact that not everything can be dug up at once. So the city remains incomplete in the way all recovered places are incomplete. We know enough to be convinced. We know enough to be uneasy. Nineveh proves that a place can vanish from human memory without ever ceasing to exist in the ground. The name survived, the city survived, but the knowledge of it did not. It had to be forced back into the light, layer by layer, by men with spades. That is the warning hiding inside the miracle. The city was never imaginary. It was simply buried so thoroughly that only the earth remembered it first. Number 6. You're in southern Iraq, in the mid-19th century. Heat lifts off the plain hard enough to blur the horizon. In front of you stands a huge mound called Tel al-Mukayyar, an oval mass of dirt and broken brick roughly 1,200 by 800 meters, rising about 20 meters above the flats around it. It does not look like the birthplace of anything. It looks dead, burnt, abandoned so completely that even the river world that once fed it is gone from sight. But the name hanging over it is For centuries, that word lived somewhere else, in scripture, in memory, in the opening movement of Abraham's story, where a family leaves home and history starts to bend. When people said they often meant a sacred origin, not a point on a map, a place of departure, a place wrapped in meaning so tightly that the ground underneath almost stopped mattering. Then, in 1853 and 1854, John George Taylor, the British vice consul at Basra, started digging into that mound. No perfect cinematic revelation, no buried palace flashing gold in the sun. He went after bricks, clay cylinders, inscriptions from the ziggurat. It sounds dry until the bricks start talking. A ruin can look like anything. A mound is just a mound until it begins to speak. These bricks did. They carried cuneiform inscriptions. Henry Rawlinson read them and tied Tel al-Mukayyar to the ancient city of That was the hinge. The mythic name got an archaeological address. Some lost places are found by treasure. Was found by literacy. You can feel the shift. Before that moment, is a word with gravity. After it, is a site, a real city in southern Mesopotamia. Walls, platforms, temples, bureaucracy, labor. Dust under fingernails. The old name had not floated free of history after all. It had stayed nailed to one patch of earth for thousands of years. People had just lost the skill to read the nails. That lands close to the big question running through this story. Why does hard-won knowledge that took generations to master vanish without a trace, and who benefits when it does? Here, the missing thing was not the city first. It was the ability to decode the city's own voice. Still, Taylor's work did not make world famous. It made possible. The explosion came later. In 1922, C. Leonard Woolley arrived to lead the joint British Museum and University of Pennsylvania expedition. He stayed, on and off, until 1934, a long campaign, real excavation, the kind that turns a name into a world. By the autumn of 1923, Woolley's team was clearing rubble from the ziggurat. Picture it correctly. Not a pyramid in empty sand, not a monument dropped into a timeless desert. Originally stood on the edge of freshwater marshes. This whole landscape once belonged to a wetter, richer southern Iraq, tied to reed beds and channels and mud and movement. The dead dryness you see now came later. Even the backdrop lies to you. That is one of the strangest things about First, the city drops out of memory, then its environment disappears too. By the time modern eyes arrive, they are already looking at the wrong world. Woolley kept digging, through mud brick collapse, through desert fill, through the ordinary debris of a city that had been monumental, then broken, then slowly flattened by time. In 1926, his team entered the Royal Cemetery. The pace changes there. Stops being merely identifiable and starts becoming vivid. You go down into graves cut deep below the surface. You find burials that are not anonymous, not scraps, not a few mixed bones and a guess. Elite tombs, objects still arranged, status still staged, death still theatrical. The most famous is PG 800, the tomb of Puapi. Gold on the body, lapis lazuli from far away, a headdress built to catch light that had not touched it in over 4,000 years. Lyres, vessels, ornaments, attendants, human beings placed in relation to power even in death. Woolley believed he was looking at some form of royal burial rite, a court descending into the grave with its ruler. Modern interpretations argue over details, over coercion, over poison, over ceremony, over how exactly these people died. The violence of the scene remains. You are no longer standing in a biblical footnote. You are standing in one of the first urban worlds, and it is showing you what concentrated power looked like at the beginning. This is the part that hits. Had been remembered as a starting point in a sacred story. The ground gave back something older, denser, and much less tidy. A Sumerian city, a cult center of the moon god, a place of administration, ritual, wealth, and brutal hierarchy. The name survived in one tradition, but the city itself belonged to a much larger, lost system of knowledge. After that, the old simple version does not hold. Was real, is the small fact. The larger one is that entire human worlds can collapse into a single borrowed reference, one famous name, one line in a text, one inherited association. Then centuries pass, and the full machinery behind that name, the language, the political order, the economy, the religious life, the landscape itself, falls away. That is not disappearance by magic, it is disappearance by reduction. Gives you one more twist. Even now, one of the most familiar labels attached to it is still not fully settled. Archaeology identifies Tel al-Mukayyar very strongly as ancient Ur. On that, the evidence from inscriptions is solid. But whether this is truly the biblical Ur of the Chaldees, Abraham's home in the later tradition, is still debated. The mound is real. The ancient city is real. The exact match between ruin and patriarchal memory is where the ground turns slippery again. So you get a strange double truth. The place was not imaginary, but the meaning people carried around for it was never the whole place. In 2016, UNESCO folded Ur into the World Heritage property called the Ahwar of southern Iraq, alongside Uruk, Eridu, and 4 marshland components. It sounds administrative, but it quietly restores the setting that history had erased. Ur does not belong only to scripture, and not only to museum glass. It belongs to a broader lost environment and a broader civilization that had to be reconstructed piece by piece. That reconstruction took generations. Readers of cuneiform, excavators, conservators, archivists. Even then, what came back was partial. It always is. You recover a city, but not all the minds that once knew how it worked. You recover tombs, but not the full logic that placed living people beside the dead. You recover the name, but not the world that made the name obvious. So when people say Ur turned out to be real, that is true, but it undersells the find. Ur did not emerge as a legend confirmed. It emerged as evidence that memory can preserve a place while stripping away almost everything that made that place legible in the first place. Looking at the cemetery that made Ur famous, Woolley used a blunt phrase: death pits. Number 5. Petra. On August 22, 1812, a Swiss traveler named Johann Ludwig Burckhardt entered the valley of Wadi Musa under another man's name, Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdallah. In his pocket he carried a firman, an official travel document from the Ottoman authorities. It was the kind of paper that could smooth a road, yet still not save you if the wrong people decided you were asking the wrong questions. He had spent years learning Arabic, years building this disguise. Now every part of it had to hold. The valley was tight with suspicion. Men watched strangers here. A foreigner who measured ruins, stared too long at carved stone, or wrote too much in a notebook was not seen as a scholar. He was a treasure hunter. That was the risk beside him on the path. Not bandits, not thirst, curiosity itself. So Burckhardt gave his guides a reason they would trust. He said he had made a vow. He said he must sacrifice a goat at the tomb of the prophet Aaron. Jabal Haroun rose above the country to the west, and a vow made more sense here than antiquarian interest. The goat was real. The excuse had to be real too. They moved through southern Jordan, between the Red Sea and the Dead Sea, through a landscape that once pulled caravans north and south between Arabia, Egypt, and Syria-Phoenicia. Burckhardt knew enough to keep his eyes modest. He could not behave like a man searching for a lost capital. He had to move like a pilgrim with one task. Then the entrance tightened. You step into a slit in the rock, a gorge so narrow the sky becomes a ribbon overhead. The walls rise in red and gold bands, polished by ages of water that now comes rarely, sudden and violent when it does. About 6 inches of rainfall here in a year. That should mean emptiness, a dry pocket of stone too poor to support more than a few scattered lives. But the path says otherwise. Along the rock face, half seen in shadow, run channels cut with geometric patience, grooves, conduits, the remains of a system too deliberate to be accidental. Water once moved through this passage under control, not wandering, directed, held back, diverted, saved. Burckhardt kept walking. The seek bent, light narrowed, then brightened. Hoofbeats struck the stone and came back in echoes. Somewhere ahead the gorge opened, but not all at once. First came color, then a straight edge where no cliff should be straight, then a column, then the whole thing arrived. A facade rose out of the sandstone like it had been waiting there in ambush, stories high. Carved, not built. A front of columns, capitals, pediments, shadowed chambers. What is now called the treasury stood in the sun at the end of the gorge, and for a second the disguise almost broke. No pilgrim was supposed to stop dead like this. Burckhardt did stop. He could not help it. Western Europe had let this place slip so far into rumor that many treated it as a half-remembered name from classical texts, a city suspended between geography and fable. But here it was. Not a sketch, not a traveler's exaggeration, a whole front of stone cut directly into the mountain. His guides were watching him. So he did what a careful man does. He looked, but not too hungrily. He asked little. He moved on. Beyond the facade, the basin opened into a city that was not one monument but many. Tombs cut into the cliffs, ruined structures on the valley floor, a theater carved into the rock itself, steps, walls, broken lines of streets and sanctuaries. This was the Nabatean capital, from the 4th century BC into the 1st century AD, and even in fragments, it still carried the shape of power. A caravan city, a customs point, a place that sat in the throat of trade and took its share of everything passing through. You can feel the logic of it under your feet. Not just the visible city, but the hidden one. Channels feeding cisterns, reservoirs catching runoff, dams turning flash floods from a threat into a resource. Pipes, tunnels, cut stone gutters, all arranged so a place that should have been defeated by water scarcity could support 30,000 to 40,000 inhabitants. In a valley that gets barely half a foot of rain in a year, somebody taught the desert to hold still. But Burckhardt could not stand there tracing systems in his mind. He could not pace distances. He could not kneel to inspect every carving. His safety depended on acting unimpressed. So he noted what he could: tombs, the great facade, the theater, the central ruins. The details came in quick glances, stored for later. Later was when this visit would become dangerous in a different way. He would have to write it down from memory, carefully enough to convince Europe, but vaguely enough to protect himself from the men standing beside him now. One of them noticed the extra attention. Another saw him lingering near the carved fronts. The mood shifted by degrees. No confrontation, something tighter than that. Fewer words, longer looks. Burckhardt understood immediately. He was not in a dead city. He was in a watched one. The place had never truly been lost here. Its paths were known. Its tombs were known. Its shrine was known. What vanished was not Petra itself, but the route by which outsiders were allowed to speak about it. The pilgrimage had to become real again. The goat that opened the gate now had to finish the performance. He cut the visit short. No protests, no visible disappointment. He turned away from the carved walls and went to carry out the vow he had invented. The animal was sacrificed at Aaron's tomb after all. Blood on stone, smoke in thin air. The ritual completed the deception so neatly that the two nearly became the same thing. By sunset he was leaving. The light drained out of the valley. The facades darkened from red to brown to black. Behind him, the city slipped back into the rock, into local memory, into the protection of geography. Ahead lay the report he would write, the one that would tell Europe that Petra was real. But even then, riding away under the borrowed name Sheikh Ibrahim ibn Abdallah, he could not know that he had seen only the skin of it. The carved fronts were the part that survived in drawings. The harder city to recover was the one inside the stone and under the sand. The dams, the tunnels, the cisterns, the hidden platforms, the logic that made a metropolis live where it should not have lasted a season. Behind him in the falling dark, beyond the treasury's facade, the gorge closed again. Number 4. Thonis-Heracleion. In 1996, Frank Goddio was working the gray water of Abukir Bay, east of Alexandria, where the Mediterranean turns shallow, silty, and deceptive. You are only about 10 meters down, but you may as well be blind. Light dies fast. Fine sediment lifts off the bottom with every movement. The seabed looks flat until it suddenly doesn't, and what matters most is usually buried. Goddio was not chasing Atlantis. He was chasing paperwork. Herodotus had written about a place the Greeks called Heracleion, where Heracles first touched Egyptian soil. Strabo placed it near Canopus, at the mouth of the Nile. Egyptian sources, meanwhile, spoke of a major port called Thonis, but no city sat on the coast where it was supposed to be. No harbor walls, no temples, no streets, just bay water and a historical shrug. So Goddio did what myth hunters almost never get to do. He treated the legend like a survey problem. With the European Institute for Underwater Archaeology, he began mapping an enormous patch of the bay, roughly 11 by 15 kilometers, not searching in the romantic sense. Gridding, scanning, logging anomalies, going back through low visibility and worse patience. Ancient writers could exaggerate. That was never the point. The point was whether generations of exact knowledge about the Egyptian coast had vanished so completely that a major port could sink out of history and leave almost nothing on land. For 4 years, the bay gave him fragments. Stone here, a sediment ridge there, shapes that look like geology until you touch them and feel the cut of a human edge. Then, in 2000, about 6.5 to 7 kilometers off the present coast, the pattern finally resolved. Gaudio's team had found a drowned city, a literal one. Temple blocks, colossal statues, coins, ceramics, harbor installations, more than 700 ancient anchors scattered through the port zone, 125 identified wrecks, most dated between the 6th and 2nd centuries BC. That is not one ship in the wrong place. That is traffic, congestion, a functioning maritime landscape with rules, choke points, repairs, failures, offerings, and debris. The numbers gave the city weight. Even then, the discovery solved only half the argument. Ruins alone do not settle history. They just move it underwater. What Gaudio needed was a name. It came up in stone. Among the finds was a black stele, about 1.90 meters high, a decree from the reign of Nectanebo I, who ruled from 378 to 362 BC. This was not just another monument hauled from the mud because it looked impressive on camera. The inscription mattered. It named the place. When scholars compared it to other evidence, the old split in the sources began to collapse. Thonis, the Egyptian city. Heracleion, the Greek city. For centuries, those names had drifted through history as if they belonged to separate ports, separate traditions, separate memories. The stele said otherwise. The port in Egyptian records and the port in Greek texts were the same place. One city, two names. At that point, the bay stopped being only an archaeological site. It became a correction to history. Gaudio was no longer just lifting statues. He was watching two civilizations line up across language. Greek visitors had called the city Heracleion. Egyptians had called it Thonis. Each tradition kept part of the map. Neither was enough on its own. Knowledge survived in pieces, scattered between scripts and shores, and the city disappeared in that gap. A place can stay famous for 2,000 years and still count as lost. The deeper Gaudio's team looked, the stranger the port became. This was likely a city founded around the 8th century BC, one of the great thresholds into Egypt, where goods and people moving through the canopic branch of the Nile were checked, taxed, and rerouted. But the seabed did not preserve one clean moment of destruction. It preserved an afterlife. Oxford researchers studying wrecks from the site found that not every vessel on the bottom was simply a ship that sank by accident. Some may have been abandoned, some deliberately deposited, some structurally reused in a port environment that kept shifting under pressure. Even Ship 43, excavated from 2011 and tentatively dated to between 785 and 481, calibrated BC, points to a working world built in local materials, including acacia wood. Not a theatrical city of legend, a real Egyptian harbor doing real Egyptian labor. So, picture what Gaudio was actually uncovering, not a frozen postcard, a port in motion, ropes straining, hulls grounding, cargo transferred, anchors dropped and lost by the hundreds. Priests, merchants, tax officials, sailors. Greek memory pinned the city to heroes in Helen and Paris before the Trojan War, because that is what stories do. The mud kept the less glamorous truth. Cities live by administration long before they die by catastrophe. And Thonis-Heracleion did die. That much is clear. The ground beneath the Nile Delta is unstable. Subsidence, sea level rise, earthquakes, tidal waves, soil liquefaction. The whole coast has a talent for unmaking certainty. By the 8th century AD, the city was fully submerged. The bay still refuses to offer a simple ending. There may have been one great collapse, perhaps around the mid-2nd century BC, that broke the heart of the port, or repeated shocks, repeated sinking, repeated retreat, until urban life simply lost the argument against water. Gaudio could raise the evidence. He could map the city. He could prove the name. The exact sequence of death stayed blurred, as if the harbor had gone under more than once in slow motion. That uncertainty changes what lost means. Petra vanished behind rock and access. Thonis-Heracleion vanished beneath a coast that physically rearranged itself. The people who knew the channels, the silts, the moorings, the temple keys, they carried knowledge measured in tides and foundations. It takes generations to build that kind of knowledge, and only a few disasters to erase it. So when Gaudio found the city in 2000, He was not recovering a fantasy from the sea. He was recovering a system that had once made Egypt legible to the outside world. The final twist is the simplest one. Scholars had long debated whether Thonis and Heracleion were two different lost ports. In the bay, under 10 meters of water and centuries of silt, they turned out to be one city, solid enough to leave customs stations, temple decrees, 700 anchors, 125 wrecks, and its own name carved in stone. It was not a legend confirmed. It was an archive drowned so completely that history split it in two. Number 3. Helike. In the winter of 373 or 372 BC, on the southwest shore of the Gulf of Corinth, a Greek city vanished so completely that later writers turned it into something close to a moral lesson. Helike, Achaea's old city by the water. The story they passed down was brutally simple. An earthquake hit at night. The ground split. The sea rushed in. By morning, the place was gone. Not damaged, gone. Ancient sources add one hard detail that makes it feel heavier. 10 Spartan ships, anchored nearby, were lost with it. That version survived for centuries because it fits the shape of a disaster people remember. One violent night, one doomed city, one wall of water. Later Greek writers already had the explanation ready. Helike had offended Poseidon, god of the sea. The sea took Helike back. That is myth doing what myth does best. It tidies the scene. Start with the mechanics. A coastal plain beside an active gulf is not a stage with one trap door. It is a moving system. Earthquake shaking, ground subsidence, liquefaction, sediment pouring in from rivers, shorelines shifting across decades and centuries. A sea surge can be part of that. So can the land itself dropping, drowning fields and roads before anyone understands what has changed. Later retellings prefer one dramatic blow. Landscapes usually destroy evidence in layers. Helike spent a very long time in the gap between famous and findable. Everybody knew the name. Ancient authors preserved the event. Travelers repeated it. But a remembered city is not the same as a located one. For generations, Helike lived in that strange category where lost places become half warning, half rumor. Famous enough to survive in text. Unreachable enough to feel unreal. In 1988, the search became technical. The Helike project began with a systematic sonar survey, because the obvious reading of the old story seemed simple. If the city was swallowed by the sea, look under the sea. The logic sounds airtight for about 5 minutes. Ancient city, night disaster, sea invasion, sunken ruins offshore. Case closed. Except the sonar found no underwater city. That was the turn. Not emotional, practical. In archaeology, a failed search is still evidence, and sometimes it is the best evidence you get. If Helike was not sitting intact on the seabed like a Greek Atlantis, then the old story had to be read differently. Not as a neat drowned island, as a coastal landscape problem, a plain displaced, buried, and rewritten. In 1991, the team changed tactics. Instead of hunting statues through open water, they started drilling boreholes on land around the old plain. It sounds less cinematic. Usually that means you are finally getting serious. Core samples do not care what the legend says. They tell you what layers are there. Marine deposits, lagoonal sediments, buried surfaces, signs that dry ground became wet ground, and then dry again, or disappeared under new material entirely. Seen that way, the ancient accounts stop sounding false. They sound compressed. Yes, something catastrophic happened on a winter night. Yes, the sea likely invaded, but the city may not have ended as a set of photogenic ruins under blue water. It may have dropped, flooded, silted over, and disappeared into a plain that kept remaking itself long after the people were dead. The old writers may have preserved the shock. The earth erased its shape. That shift led to excavation. In 2000, the Helike project began its first systematic dig campaigns. Between 2001 and 2011, the Helike area started yielding real material evidence, not a fantasy skyline, not marble avenues waiting under the surf. Evidence in pieces, layers, and disturbed contexts. That is exactly what a violent coastal landscape should leave behind. One of the strangest results came at Rizomylos. Archaeologists uncovered a well-preserved early Helladic coastal settlement with rich contents, much earlier than the classical city destroyed in 373/372 BC. At first glance, it looks like a detour. It was actually a forensic clue. It showed that the Helike plain had been occupied for a very long time, and that the whole zone carried a deep history of habitation, burial, and environmental change. The search for one lost city widened into something harder, a map of repeated human settlement on ground that would not stop moving. Here, myth and evidence finally touched. The myth said Helike vanished in one unforgettable event. The evidence said the event was real, but the disappearance was messier than the legend allowed. Sonar failure mattered, boreholes mattered, excavation seasons mattered. The city was not missing because nobody had looked carefully. It was missing because people were looking for the wrong kind of disappearance. A broader pattern comes back into view here. When hard-won knowledge vanishes, it often goes with the landscape that made it useful. Helike's people knew a coast of harbors, fields, channels, and anchorage points on the Gulf of Corinth. Then came one winter night, or one winter night followed by years of geological aftershocks written into mud and water, and that knowledge no longer matched the ground under their feet. Later generations inherited the name, but not the map. Even now, the exact mechanism is still debated. Was it above all a tsunami? Was it ground subsidence amplified by sea invasion? Was it earthquake damage followed by sedimentary burial so thorough that the plain effectively edited the city out? Modern geoarchaeology does not offer one theatrical answer. That is part of what makes the case convincing. Clean legends are suspicious. Confused deposits are not. Helike turned out to be real, but not in the way the myth promised. There was no simple underwater reveal waiting for divers. There was a vanished city dispersed through an unstable plain, half remembered by ancient writers and half hidden by the mechanics of coasts themselves. Picture that winter coast after the shaking stopped. Water lying over broken ground, the ships gone, the shoreline no longer matching memory. By dawn, there may have been no clear edge between land and sea at all. Only a flat, silent plain starting to bury a city people would keep describing long after they no longer knew where to stand and point. Number 2. Derinkuyu Underground City. In 1963, in the town of Derinkuyu in central Turkey, a homeowner renovating his house knocked through a wall and found empty space behind it. Not a crawl space, not a storage niche, a room. Then another opening. Then a passage sloping down into the rock beneath the town. 2 years later, in 1965, the site opened to visitors. But the number that matters here is 85. That is how far the excavated complex descends below the surface. Start with the shaft. 55 meters. A ventilation chimney cut straight down through the tuff, deep enough to move air, also functioning as a well. This was not a place to hide for an afternoon. Air and water are siege math. If people planned to stay underground through raids, they needed both in volume, under control, and protected. Turkish museum authorities note that not every well opened to the surface. Some were deliberately disconnected at ground level, so attackers could not poison the water supply from above. A single design choice, a single number, a tactic built into stone. Then look at the rooms. Stables first, because animals come before comfort. Storage rooms, kitchens, wine and oil presses, churches, a missionary school, passages linking level to level. Circular stone doors that could be rolled across tunnels from inside. Nothing about that is accidental. Nothing about it survives on folklore alone. It exists because violence returned often enough to justify the labor. The rock made carving possible. Cappadocia sits in soft volcanic tuff, easier to cut by hand than granite or basalt. But cutting rock is one thing. Organizing life underground is another. Derinkuyu was not just a hole in the ground. It was circulation. Air moving down shafts, people moving through bottlenecks, food moving into storage, waste moving out of living space, livestock kept apart, because 20 sheep in the wrong chamber turn refuge into a problem in about an hour. From the surface, the place feels mythical. Underground, it runs on logistics. The numbers sharpen the picture. Up to 20,000 people, by the highest common estimate, with livestock and stores. Even if that figure marks maximum refuge capacity rather than daily life, the scale changes completely. This is not a family bunker, it is a population event. A town or several communities going below ground with enough planning to keep breathing, drinking, eating, and praying while danger moved overhead. Derinkuyu matters because it preserves a specific kind of knowledge. Someone had to learn how deep a shaft needed to be before air became reliable. Someone had to decide which wells must never open to the surface. Someone had to test how narrow a corridor could be and still move people, yet still be sealed by one rolling stone door. That is not myth. It is survival knowledge, refined by repeated threat. UNESCO places Derinkuyu and nearby Kaimakli inside the World Heritage Landscape of Cappadocia and links these subterranean towns especially to refuge use in later Byzantine periods, including resistance during Arab invasions. The old fantasy of an underground kingdom gives way to something harder: fear, repetition. A region exposed to attack often enough that entire communities invested in architecture meant for days when the world above became temporarily unusable. Derinkuyu is also not unique. That may be the clearest clue of all. National Geographic describes hundreds of subterranean safe havens across Cappadocia. Derinkuyu is famous because it is one of the largest excavated examples, not because it stands alone. So the 1963 discovery was not the revelation of one impossible city. It was the accidental reopening of a defensive system spread across a landscape. One homeowner breaks through a basement wall and finds a void. The real story extends far beyond that house. It is distributed beneath the region. Only about 10% of Derinkuyu is currently visitable. 10%. Everything tourists photograph, every tunnel and chamber lit for the public, is a fraction of the whole. 90% remains outside the standard walkthrough, either unexcavated, inaccessible, or not presented. So the famous underground city most people think they know is still mostly out of sight, not lost in the legendary sense, hidden in a more unsettling way, documented, named, and still largely unseen. The disputed part is the beginning. Who started it? Claims range from deep antiquity to later phases of major Byzantine development and expansion. Hittites are often invoked, Phrygians too. Public-facing sources are careful here, and they should be. The strongest picture is layered use across time, not a single founder following a single blueprint. That uncertainty makes the site more convincing. Real places used for centuries collect edits, new chambers, new functions, new defensive logic. Fantasy arrives complete. Derinkuyu looks revised. Picture it from inside. You are 40 meters down, then 60, then deeper still. The corridor narrows. The ceiling drops. Somewhere above, the town goes on with daylight, roads, weather, animals, smoke. Down here, different measurements matter. Door diameter, shaft depth, water access, capacity. Survival depends on numbers solved before you arrived. Then the people who maintain those solutions are displaced, killed, scattered, or absorbed into a different way of living. The knowledge does not vanish in a blaze. It goes quiet. A blocked passage here, a sealed room there, a wall plastered over in a house above. Within generations, refuge becomes rumor. Derinkuyu was real, but not as a fantasy civilization hidden from history. It was something more practical, and in some ways more disturbing. A machine for waiting out human violence. Architecture carried the memory. The whole place rests on one assumption, that what stands above ground cannot be trusted to stay safe. So when the knowledge faded, the city did not sink like Helike, or burn like other lost places. It stayed where it was, underfoot, until one man in 1963 broke through a wall. Only 10% is open. Number 1. Pompeii. What if the story is true in the most literal sense? Not a ruined city under fields, not a legend pinned to a mountain. An entire Roman town, caught in a single day of 79 AD so completely that when you open a wall, a doorway, a bakery, you do not find the remains of life. You find life interrupted. A place can vanish so completely that for centuries people walk above it, cut through it, write about it, even touch its walls, and still fail to understand what they are looking at. Across the Bay of Naples, roughly 20 miles from Pompeii, Pliny the Younger watched it begin. The date is still argued over. For generations, the manuscript tradition pointed to August 24th, 79 AD. But a charcoal inscription found in Pompeii, dated October 17th, along with autumn clues from the city, has pushed many scholars toward a later eruption. The exact day remains unsettled. The disaster does not. Pliny saw a cloud rising over Vesuvius, shaped, he wrote, like a pine tree, trunk first, then branches spreading above. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, was not a poet on a hillside. He was commander of the Roman fleet at Misenum. So, while one Pliny watched, the other launched ships and sailed toward the bay, toward Stabii, toward people trying to escape. That split gives something lost places almost never leave behind together, a witness and a route into the disaster. One man records the sky, another goes in. On the shore below that cloud sat Pompeii, a working Roman town of streets, shops, frescoed houses, bakeries, shrines, and election notices painted on walls. It was busy enough to seem permanent right up until permanence ended. The first phase was not cinematic. It was pumice, ash, weight. Roof load, street depth, breathing air turning into abrasive dust. People sheltered indoors because stone walls looked safer than open roads. The walls did nothing for what was piling up overhead. Roofs began to fail. Buildings filled. Streets disappeared under falling debris. Then came the surges. Fast, superheated, low to the ground, moving through the city after the fallout. Pompeii was not simply damaged, it was sealed. Over 1,000 victims' remains have been found there, but the number alone does not explain why the place felt mythical for so long. Cities usually die by pieces. One district burns, another is sacked, builders raise a new city on top, and the original plan disappears. Pompeii did something stranger. It exited history almost all at once. Because it vanished under volcanic material rather than later construction, what survived was not just masonry. It was arrangement, rooms with their contents, streets with their ruts, messages on walls waiting for an election no one would ever hold. Even that did not bring it back. For centuries, Pompeii survived mainly as literary memory. People knew Vesuvius had destroyed towns. They had Pliny's letters to Tacitus. They had names drifting through texts. But a text is not a street corner. It is not a doorway with scorch marks. So the city hung in that half-state where ancient places turn almost mythical. Too well attested to dismiss. Too physically absent to grasp. Knowledge can be won, recorded, copied, passed down for generations, and still fail at the last step. If the people who know how to connect words to ground are gone, the truth can sit inches below your feet and not return. In the late 1500s, architect Domenico Fontana cut a water channel through the area. His workers crossed walls. They found inscriptions. They disturbed the buried city itself. But they did not recover Pompeii, because finding evidence is not the same as recognizing it. Sometimes lost knowledge does not disappear because no trace remains. It disappears because the trace appears without the system needed to read it. Fontana's canal passed through a Roman ghost and kept moving. The real unmasking began in 1748. Under Bourbon patronage, military engineer Roque Joaquin de Alcubierre started excavations that opened buried streets and structures on a scale no accidental cut ever could. The myth acquired edges. Masonry, thresholds, painted rooms. Even then, the identity was not instantly secure. A buried Roman city near Vesuvius is one thing. Pompeii specifically is another. So for 15 years, the ground kept giving up evidence while the name still lagged behind it. Then in 1763, an inscription settled it. The municipality of the Pompeians. Not rumor, not literary echo, not a maybe. Pompeii. That was the point where most mythical places would shrink. Once the name locks to the stones, the imagination usually loses ground. Pompeii did the opposite. The more excavators uncovered, the less it behaved like an archaeological site in the usual sense. It started to feel like a stopped clock of Roman life. Ovens still shaped like ovens, streets still channeling traffic, wall notices still arguing for candidates, frescoes still flashing color from private rooms. The city mattered not because it was grander than Rome, but because it was ordinary at full resolution. Then, in 1863, Giuseppe Fiorelli found the detail that turned Pompeii from a buried town into a wound you can look at. Bodies buried in ash decomposed and left voids inside the hardened volcanic material, empty cavities in human shape. Fiorelli poured plaster into those spaces. What emerged were not bodies turned to stone. They were casts of absence, sometimes with bones still inside. A little over 100 casts have been made, enough to give Pompeii its most unforgettable image. People in the posture of their last second, a curled hand, bent knees, a face covered. Not statues, negative space made visible. You can feel the city turn there. Buried streets and painted walls prove location. They prove date. They prove Roman urban life. The casts prove timing. These people were not ancient in the abstract. They were interrupted. Pompeii was not preserved like a monument. It was preserved like an event. Pompeii belongs at the peak. Troy had to be argued into history. Derinkuyu had to be broken open. Pompeii gives a harsher answer to the same question underneath all of them. Why does hard-won knowledge vanish without a trace, and who benefits when it does? Sometimes no one benefits. The mountain wins. The witnesses die. The texts survive without the ground. Later generations strike the truth with a shovel and still do not know what they have hit. Since 1997, Pompeii, Herculaneum, and Torre Annunziata have stood under UNESCO protection. An excavation there has continued so long that it now has its own history. But Pompeii is still not finished telling us how it died. Even the date remains contested, with August 24th facing evidence that points past October 17th. The city is famous because it was frozen. The city is still alive to archaeologists because the freeze was not complete. Pliny the Younger watched the cloud rise. Later, writing to Tacitus, he gave Pompeii the line that carried it through burial, rumor, and rediscovery. I believed I was perishing with the world.